Hi, Serge. Welcome to our online programming part 6. I got a dog over here. She wants to say hi. Say hi, Hope. She's maybe not into it. All right, well, we have now been meeting with this platform officially for 6 weeks. And I want you to know, before we do anything else, to take heart, because there is a light at the end of the tunnel. We don't happen to know when that is yet. But I'm thinking about you, I'm praying for you, and I'm really missing you guys like crazy. But this week, we are continuing our study on a new unit, which started last week, about autonomy in our faith. I hope you all remember our working definition of the word and how it relates to us, that autonomy is when you are in control of what you do, think, say, and believe. And to remind you that it is always your choice, your decision, whether to follow God and believe in his word. That's on you. Last week, we heard from Pastor Jim Barnett, who's a friend of our church and the Illinois Great Rivers Conference, which we are a part of. He was coming to you to share with you the moment in his life when the church and his faith and his relationship with Jesus became real. This week, we'll hear from another friend of Serge who has a special story to share about choosing to follow God, even when it was really hard in her life. So let's start there. I want you to think about a time in your life when it was hard, when something maybe unexplainable happened, or a tragedy struck you and your family, or a time when you were dealing with something that made you feel like you weren't heard or seen or loved or cared for. We've talked about this before, but all of us, every one of us, have times in our lives like that, when pushing forward and choosing to keep going is really tough. And then, after you think about a time like that, I want you to remember, or try to remember, how did God feel to you during that time? Did he feel real? Did he feel tangible, like he was holding your hand, walking alongside you, not ever leaving you alone? Or did you feel alone? Did you feel far from God? Did it feel like he had abandoned you? And if it did, you should know that it's okay. You should know that in life, as Christians, really as people, that instances like that are totally normal and they're a part of being human. So don't be hard on yourself if that is the case. That's all right. Like I said, tonight we're going to hear a testimony from one of your adult leaders. So Steph Hoy is going to share about a time when something in her life happened and it just really sucked. And it was really hard. But she's going to tell you about finding God and praising him in the midst of that storm. So here's her story.
Hey Serge, it's Stephanie. I'm actually in my car waiting for my coworkers to show up to work today when I was really thinking about what Kelsey asked us to do today. While I grew up in the church, I don't remember a time where I didn't believe Jesus was with me one step of the way. However, there have been many times in my life where I thought, you know what? I can either stay on this path of believing that Jesus really is here with me, or I can just walk away. Some of those were the very worst days of my life when I lost my best friends, not literally, but they walked away from me and made my life to be hell for most of my high school career. And then there's probably the absolute worst day of my life where I remember laying in a hospital bed, my mother on one side, a nurse on the other handing me a pamphlet with Jesus on the cover saying, other women who've lost children have found this very helpful. And my mother saying, but she's got a really strong faith. She'll be fine. And I wanted to say to both of them, yeah, but that doesn't mean I'm not mad about this situation and angry that this happened to me, that Matthew doesn't have siblings now because of this. It's always been hard. But I always know that Jesus is with me. Through my first miscarriage, I honestly felt his arms around me, holding me and caring for me. I grew up in a household where if something didn't go perfectly, it was God's will that it didn't, and that it was his fault you didn't get it. And, that's not the case. It just means that God has something different in store for you and a different plan. And because I didn't have those other children, I was able to foster an amazing little boy. And through God's plan, reunite him with his mother. And that really felt like my call at that time. Now my call feels like being with you guys. And I love watching you grow and share your stories. And if ever you want to share yours with me, I'm more than willing to listen. Thanks, Serge.
Okay, so once again, we want to say a huge thank you to Steph for sharing with us tonight. We know that in sharing our stories and being able to be vulnerable with each other, it empowers us in our own lives and our own walks of faith. Like Steph shared, something awful had happened in her life. And when we study scripture, we see that there are examples all throughout the Bible of the same sort of thing happening to people back then. Their tragedies may not look exactly the same as ours, present day, but they still faced adversity and had to do very hard things. And tonight, the scripture we're looking at comes from John chapter 20, verses 24 through 30. This is a story that you've probably heard before. It's about Thomas. Sometimes in the church, we refer to him as Doubting Thomas. Now, months ago, we talked about the disciples in the locked upper room after Jesus was crucified, and how they were scared of similar persecution, they were grieving this monumentous loss, and then how Jesus appeared to them in that room, and he made this proclamation of peace to his disciples. Remember, he said, "Peace be with you." But what we didn't talk about in that passage is that Thomas, who was one of the 12 disciples, he wasn't in that locked upper room. He didn't see Jesus with his own eyes at first when all of his buddies did. So when the disciples did find him and tell them that they've seen Jesus and that he's alive, and they try to preach this good news to Thomas, Thomas is kind of skeptical. And Thomas says in verse 25, "Unless I see the nail marks in his hands and put my finger where the nails were and put my hand into his side, I will not believe it." As the scripture says, eventually he does see Jesus, and he does just that. He puts his hands to Jesus' side, he sees the nail marks in his hands, and then Thomas does believe. And then Jesus says to him in verse 27 to stop doubting and believe. Now, I think Thomas gets a really bad rap in the church. And in our discussions about him, we see him as this sort of like cynical, hardened disciple who doesn't have faith that the Jesus that returned was real. He asks for clarification or proof, right? He says, I want to feel it. I want to see it. And I understand that. But I think I relate to Thomas a bit in quite a few ways. I mean, one, we have to think about what exactly Thomas had been through at that point. He's had a pretty rough couple of days. He's had to come to grips with being at the Last Supper, hearing Jesus tell him and his friends that the time has come, that someone would betray him. He's watched his best friend, his teacher, his leader die in front of him. And then in the days surrounding his death, he's had to live in fear of a similar reality, knowing that he's in danger, all while grieving. And he was dealing with all those complicated emotions that come with grief. So, yes, Thomas should have had more faith. But honestly, so should I. And so should all of us at times. I think at the end of the day, Thomas was just a guy who had been through a lot, and he was leery of trusting others and trusting the world because the world had really let him down. He had seen a lot, and it affected him. It made him a bit rough around the edges. It left him questioning if he could really trust people or if he even knew who he was anymore. And I don't know about you, but I've been there before too. And I think Steph in her testimony today shared that, in a sense, she has too. Sometimes life hits us hard, and the world can let us down, and whatever is happening around us is so big and so scary and so unpredictable that we're left questioning if we can trust anything at all, if we're even who we thought we were anymore. And I wonder how many times in my own life that I've acted in ways that made God say, "Stop doubting, Kelsey, and believe." The point is, doubt and questioning and what we might call a crisis of faith, it's a part of life. And it doesn't make you less of God's beloved child or less a member of this family or less valuable to the world around you and the ministries that you serve. It just makes you human, like Thomas. And what we have to note here is that Jesus still loved Thomas, even though he doubted. Jesus still had a place for Thomas, even though he questioned him. In fact, Jesus still used Thomas. After Jesus ascended into heaven, Thomas went on to be a missionary, preaching outside of the Roman Empire to communities around the world. He was still usable, still valuable to the kingdom, even though he had some doubts and he questioned Jesus. Thomas was still a beloved, precious member of Jesus' family and of his disciples, even though he had a rough time and he asked some questions, even challenged Jesus. And I want you to know that God has room in his kingdom and at his table for everyone. For those who doubt, those who wander, those who ask questions, and certainly those that sometimes feel alone or far away from God. Your value and your worthiness as a beloved child of God is not at all defined by your doubts or your uneasiness, especially when life is hard and you're trying to find your way. And I hope you know that, Serge. I hope you know that in those times when life doesn't make a whole lot of sense, we're right here with you. When you ask questions about the church and your faith and who God is, we are also alongside of you. We've asked those questions before, or some of us are asking them right now, and that's okay. On days when you have doubts and when you feel alone, just take heart knowing that you'll never really be alone, because we will be with you. God is walking with you. He's willing to let you put your hands in his side and feel the nail marks in his hands. He will be patient with you. And just take heart that even in your doubts, even when times are complicated and messy and tragedy happens and you feel far away from the person that you once were, we've been there before too. And we'll be there with you through all of it. So we love you. And we're going to be here for you through all of this, no matter what. But we will see you soon. Bye.